The Nightmare Convergence. Nathan Davis stood alone at the corner of Acorn and Lake Streets, looking up at the building that loomed over the block around it. The house had a light gray brick exterior, with a wide bay window that overlooked the street, a 2-car garage, fronted with an immaculately cut lawn, and a flower garden that could have been on the front of a home and garden magazine. It looked identical to the dozens of other McMansions that Nathan had passed on his ride through the windy streets. But a darkness seemed to hover over this particular house. Though the day was bright and warm, the shadows that hid among the eaves and arches were dark and menacing. The curtains were drawn with the intention to keep out prying eyes. It was as if the house itself were looking down upon him, like a boot hovering over an ant. 167 Acorn. Since childhood, Nathan's dreams had been vivid and lucid, and as a young child he had struggled with differentiating between reality and his dream state, commonly referencing experiences that to him felt like memories, but his friends and family would look confused and say those events never took place. The older he became, the more his two realities became intermixed, eventually forcing his parents to send him to undergo dozens of tests and analyses to determine what could be wrong with him and how to fix his fractured mind. Nathan had hated every minute with the doctors. He didn't feel broken, and instead knew that it was the world around him which was fragmented, not him. The doctors had prescribed him medication to help him sleep in a bid to break the dreaming and reality cycle and clear his mind. The medication worked for a time. His real memories became more focused and clear, but the longer he was medicated, the more it left Nathan feeling empty, as if he were missing a part of himself. When he secretly stopped taking the drugs, Nathan began to journal events to be clear in which reality he was operating and try to fake normalcy. But as the drugs wore off, an avalanche of the dream reality which had been locked away crashed over him, and he clung to the edges of his mind as if gripping to a broken board in the ocean of his mind as a hurricane crashed over him with waves of memories. Slowly, Nathan adapted to his dual reality, the journals keeping his mind sharper and focused, and keeping the two distinct planes separate. And now he stood at the crux of his two realities, looking at a building that he hoped wouldn't exist, and yet stood before him nonetheless. Withdrawing the carefully folded picture from his pocket, Nathan forced himself to stare at the image. Though the pain cut him to the core, the picture transfixed him to his current reality. Flipping it over, he read the address that was scrawled on the back: 167 Acorn. In his years of dreaming, he knew his two states of consciousness could merge, what he called convergences, situations where his memories and current events combined into a mutated reflection of one another. These times were the hardest, as his mind became foggy as it tried to meld the two parts together. But he had never experienced a nightmare convergence. With shaking hands, Nathan folded the picture up and slipped it back into his pocket. Setting his shoulders back and holding his chin up, Nathan closed his eyes and took a mindful breath as he inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly. Not everything had been a waste of time with the doctors. You know what doesn't work. Finally, knowing what he had to do, Nathan walked down the hot asphalt driveway and around to the narrow walkway between the house and garden. The depths of the front porch swirled with hungry shadows that reached out with smoky tendrils, desiring to consume him. He stood at the threshold of the porch, his left foot resting on the first step. You have to do it. Take the first step. Take the step, you coward. You can't. You wouldn't. Don't. Gripping the railing, Nathan's stomach churned and legs and shoulders tensed, preparing for a blow as he took the first step into the dark porch. You did it. Now what? Nathan crossed the porch and instinctively knocked on the door, which ended up much louder than he had intended. Why are you knocking? Don't be stupid. Go through the back. You know what's inside. Nathan peered through the window in the door, but the interior of the house was obscured by the black blinds. Pressing his cheek against the window, Nathan listened for several breaths, when he heard what sounded like the scuttling of dozens of fingernails across a tiled floor. You're in it now, you idiot. Don't go in. Try the door handle. Listening for another minute more, as the scuttling sound receded, Nathan's hand drifted down to the door handle and slowly turned the handle, which, to his surprise, wasn't locked as he pushed the door inwards. Hello? Don't say anything. Be quiet. Get out of here. Go in, you pussy. Though it was the brightest of days outside, the darkness in the house was near absolute. You've pissed it off, you idiot. Pulling his backpack from his shoulder, Nathan withdrew the large camping flashlight and clicked it on. Directing the light inside, it pierced the darkness as if it were a dense fog that consumed the light instead of letting it pass through it, barely illuminating the small entry room and closet on the other side of the door. Now's your chance. Get out of here. You've come this far. Go in. Stepping carefully through the doorway, Nathan suppressed a shiver as soon as he entered the house. The temperature in the house was at least 15 degrees cooler inside than outside, his breath lightly misting in front of his face. You've been here. You know what it is. Get out, get out. You're an asshole. Nathan shined the light around his surroundings, though he already knew what he would see. Nothing. The bare walls were painted in their primer white, and nothing hung from them. No pictures of a smiling family, no mirrors, or trendy catchphrases in block letters. Are you gonna go? Just go there. The foyer opened into a large open concept with the large kitchen and island on his left, and what would be a living room in front of him. Like the walls, the cavernous room was devoid of furniture or other belongings. Though Nathan walked gently across the tile floor, each of his footfalls echoed like gunshots through the barren room. How many times have you been here, and yet you still go? Why are we here? Why? Nathan paused and looked behind him at the open door with the bright shining light, knowing the warmth of the afternoon sun, which now seemed so distant, a world away and yet only half a dozen steps. I need to do this. This is stupid. What are you thinking? Get out. Turning away from the comparatively bright light of the outside, Nathan took the path he knew by heart as he navigated the labyrinthian home, passing empty bedrooms and bathrooms, to the narrow wooden staircase at the end of the hall, which led down into the basement. The air at the top of the stairs stank of a combination of smells that his nose had never known before, a mixture of sweaty socks, damp earth, and rotten food. Setting himself once more, Nathan closed his eyes and took another breath. Fuck off. You don't have to do this. Go now, and don't come back. Nathan swallowed with a parched throat, taking another deep breath before opening his eyes to complete darkness. Panic set in as the air was sucked from his lungs at the unexpectedly inky blackness that engulfed him. His thumb flicked the flashlight on and off in vain as he shook it violently. This is new. Go now. Stripping the backpack off, Nathan clawed at the zippers and pockets of the bag until finally he felt a couple of loose batteries at the bottom of one of the compartments. What was that? Did you hear that? The sound echoed down the hallway towards him, 1,000 fingernails scraping against the tile floor. A tingling crept up his back, and his shoulders tightened defensively as he thrashed about himself in the darkness, the batteries clattering to the floor. It's getting closer. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Nathan knelt on the cold floor and with blind, quivering hands felt out around him as the scraping and clawing grew closer. Finally, his fingers found the batteries, and he quickly uncapped the flashlight and deposited the batteries into the handle before clicking the light back on, illuminating the narrow hallway around him. Shining the light down the stairs, Nathan clutched his backpack and scampered through the doorway to the stairwell, slamming it shut and locking it behind him, just as something crashed into the other side with a loud bang. Whatever was on the other side began to scratch and scrape at the door which divided them, as Nathan hoisted the backpack over his shoulders and hastily descended into the basement. The odor was somehow worse in the pits of the basement, adding a layer of burnt ashes and rotting decay. Find a way out. You can still get out. Keep going. Don't back down now, you coward. The basement was where the dream reality diverged into an open-ended number of outcomes. Reaching into his pocket, Nathan pulled the picture from his pocket again and shined the light on it. The picture was colored in black wax on lined paper of a young girl cowering in a corner, obviously terrified. Folding the picture and putting it back in his pocket, Nathan withdrew the multicolored gun from behind his belt. He had practiced with it for hours and had become a good shot, and he felt more confident with the grip in his hands. The basement was unfinished, with a gray concrete slab as the floor, and chipboard walls were built up. Dark stains discolored the floor around a drain near the stairs, from which the worst of the gut-wrenching smells seemed to be emanating. She's here. You have to get her. No, you don't. He is here. You have to get out. Don't be stupid. You're here. Get her. Nathan maneuvered as carefully and silently as he could through the wood-paneled halls, both the light and gun raised before him. He heard her before he saw her, crying and whimpering softly. She was always in the same place, handcuffed to a pipe, bound and gagged exactly as the smudged drawing in his pocket. He had been here many times, and the desire for flight had overwhelmed him every time, which was no different this time. These weren't the happy dreams of summer fun or the sad dreams of the death of a non-existent dog. This was a nightmare. He had prepared for it, but he wasn't sure he had prepared enough. Building the nerve, he rounded the corner into her room, and like every time, the horror of what had happened to her was a gut punch. Go to her, get her, comfort her. The girl squealed when she saw him, whether in hope, terror, or a combination, Nathan didn't know, but he moved to her side. It's okay, you're safe now, I'm here now. The girl's eye widened in disbelief. The other was gone. Putting the gun and flashlight down beside her, Nathan pulled the chisel, hammer, and small saw from his backpack and got to work on the handcuffs. Every time the dreams were different with what worked in time and what didn't. He hoped he didn't need to use the saw, That was the worst. He worked grimly, trying to hammer at the links in the chains, but his hands had begun to shake uncontrollably as soon as he put them to work. Nathan closed his eyes once more, taking a deep breath. "You have done this. You can do it. No, we can do it." Nathan opened them once more, placing the chisel between the links once more, and hammered, audibly snapping the link, and the girl began to squeal hysterically beside him. Turning to reassure her, a sudden, inhumanely powerful blow landed across Nathan's back, sending him crashing into the wooden wall in front of him. The taste of wood and copper filled his mouth as he felt his nose crunch and snap. Knowing that the second blow was imminent, Nathan ducked and rolled along the cold, hard floor, as the wall where his head had been a moment before exploded into dust. The figure that towered over Nathan was shrouded in a misty black aura, hollow, lifeless eyes with gaunt and twisted features. A face that he had seen countless times in the nightmare. The third blow didn't miss as its foot connected with Nathan's ribs, knocking the air from his lungs and sending him spinning across the floor. As Nathan laid on the floor collecting himself, an inhuman roar echoed throughout the basement. The girl had stood behind the creature and buried the chisel into its back. The roar turned into a grotesque laughter as it whirled on the girl, slapping her with the back of its hand and descending upon her with a snarl. Finally, as breath returned to his lungs, Nathan crawled across the floor, the pain lancing from his ribs with each foot he moved, his hand reaching out to the gun that lay discarded on the floor. Raising the weapon up, as he had practiced hundreds of times, by spraying the water gun at the balloons in his backyard from roughly the same distance, Nathan pulled on the trigger, releasing a stream of water that sprayed true. "This won't work. What are you thinking?" He had bought the holy water off the internet with his parents' credit card. He didn't know if it would work, or if it was holy water, but it was the best he could hope for. The scream that reverberated through the chamber cut to Nathan's core as he clutched his chest, feeling like his insides were splitting apart. When the pain eased, Nathan saw that the creature was gone, and he crawled to the girl who lay deathly still on the floor. "She's dead. She can't be dead." Nathan reached her side and saw her chest rising slowly. Her name was Elizabeth, a teenage girl who had been missing for several weeks. The newspapers spoke about her daring escape from her kidnapper, though her tales of her tormentor were chalked up to hysteria. Nathan had pleaded for her not to tell of his involvement, and hadn't given her his name, instead taking solace in the fact that this nightmare could be over for him, and her. They hadn't seen the creature again that day, but now it knew about Nathan, and he was sure he would see it again, because his dreams told him so. The tree. For as long as I could remember, I had been frightened of the tree in our backyard. In the spring, it would explode into life, sprouting bone-white blossoms that exuded the suffocating smell of death. In summer, its full branches seemed as if they were looming over the entire yard, leaving me with the feeling of being trapped or caged. In the fall, it shrouded itself in leaves the color of blood. They would rain down to the ground and leave behind a lingering carpet of decay. In the winter, it would tap, tap, tap its bony fingers on the side of the house. I would watch from my bed underneath the window as it cast shadows, like skeletal hands that always seemed to be reaching for me. Then, one early spring, a storm rolled through. I watched the swaying branches and the horrible tree as I lay frightened in my bed. I closed my eyes and I wished with all my heart that it would just disappear. I saw the flash of blinding light through my eyelids. I felt the concussive boom a moment later, and I knew I didn't have to be afraid anymore. I stood where the tree had been the next day. I felt happy as the men in the yard began cutting up that terrible old tree, removing pieces of the huge trunk that had fallen on our house. And I watched with a little sadness as my mother stood in the doorway of what had once been my bedroom, weeping. Beneath the quaking aspen. He buried her in the forest before the leaves of the quaking aspen turned golden. No one noticed the tamped-down soil, or the way the wild grasses died back all around her, or even the circle of whimsy-brown mushrooms that erupted soon after. And when autumn came and the leaves changed, the trembling giant whose roots she fed turned scarlet instead. "I am here," she called. "Please find me." But after the first frost, the leaves turned rusty and were then indistinguishable from the rest. No one noticed her, buried in the forest beneath the quaking aspen. Snow falls, blanketing her in a cold white solitude, with only her thoughts for company, and she wonders, does her family know she isn't coming home? Or do they maybe think she's just run away from it all? Does anyone suspect foul play? Or has he, once again, convinced everyone of his harmless temper? We argued, but I loved her. I never would have done anything to hurt her. Then why did she, the other woman, drive her car in neutral into the lake? She wonders what he'll say about her. We argued, but I loved her. She said she would leave me 100 times, and I guess she finally did. She wonders if anyone ever found the unused airplane tickets in the back of her underwear drawer, rolled up in a sock with the wad of 20s she'd been collecting for months. Did he find them? Is that why? Is that why she's rotting away in the earth now? Spring arrives and the bugs return, but she only has so much of herself left to give them. The grass grows back, greener than before, and the roots of the quaking aspen snake through her ribs. He returns and steps on her grave, just with one foot at first. She thinks he's testing the ground or checking for bones sticking out of the soil. When he doesn't fall through, he stands on her grave fully. The pressure on her chest is unbearable, but he already broke her heart once. When he breaks her ribs, she feels nothing. He steps off quickly, sheepishly, and reaches forward. He grabs a branch from the tree he buried her under and snaps it off with a quick tug. Is that how she died? She remembers his hands on her neck, and then nothing else. It was so quick. They argued. She told him she didn't love who he was anymore, but she never got the chance to leave, like she'd planned to for months. He walks away with his souvenir, and she doesn't see him again for a long time. A million thoughts fill her up, and she wonders if she'll ever have peace from them. They never ceased while she was alive, in her waking hours or otherwise, and now they continue even as her body returns to the earth. Restful oblivion does not come to her, and she wonders, if not in death, then when? Did Nikki worry when she didn't show up? Or did they just assume she never meant to arrive in the first place? Are they angry she broke her promise? What about her cat? Did they keep Mr. Jenkins? Is he healthy and happy with Nicky? And, more than anything, she worries no one knew her thoughts in those final months, because he stole her from her family and friends, stole her from herself even. She'd said so many awful things to so many people, and all they'd ever wanted was for her to be happy and safe. But she never listened, was too proud to admit she'd been wrong, until it was too late. She almost didn't recognize who she was in those final months anymore. Why does she even care? She's not anymore. She begins growing out of her broken body the following year, and feels for the first time in a long time the gentle rays of sunlight beating down on her through the budding leaves of the surrounding quaking aspen trees. However, almost before she can appreciate the new sensations that come with being a sprouting aspen tree, a browsing deer strips her of her leaves, and then a hare finishes her off. But that's fine. Her roots remain, and she continues pulling water and other nutrients from the ground for the giants she shares herself with. They don't speak, but she feels their sympathy as they wordlessly console her and offer her their full support when spring arrives again. She grows quickly with their tender support, and when the browsing deer returns, she has more than enough of herself to give. When they see him again, they almost don't recognize him. He's older, grayer, feebler. He walks with a cane now and uses it to push around the mulchy layers of decaying leaves. The top layer of soil has grown sugary over the years, and he has had to hold on to branches as he steps up the incline or risks slipping. But he is himself still, and they could never forget his eyes. Warm like honey, hard like amber, and sometimes colder than moonlight. Wrinkles and time have softened his piercing gaze, but they still feel it as he looks about. There's an unmistakable hint of sharpness, like raw edges on smooth river stones. He does not recognize them. They have grown up strong and tall since he saw them last, and the animal path he followed all those years ago has meandered ever so slightly off track. He is not lost, but neither can he find his destination. He looks up, straining his neck, searching for the tree with the cracked-off branch, searching for the piece of them he broke. He turns around 3 full times, facing north after each spin. Still, he does not find what he's looking for. Forgiveness, closure, maybe the tree he buried them beneath, which no longer stands. It blew over some years ago, when the summer storms came. The uprooted stump is just to his right, but he does not make the connection, because the thick trunk was hauled away for campfire fuel the same year it fell. He leans against his cane, silently stewing over his dilemma. He's never had much patience for anything, really. The wind rattles through their bare branches, and a chill creeps through him. He shivers, hunching his shoulders against the stiff wind, and lifts his cane. He turns right, shuffling through the frost-laden leaves, and unknowingly walks over their grave. He stumbles over the exposed roots still attached to the rotting stump and falls, hard. He lays there for a long moment, winded from his rough landing. When he recovers enough to move, his shifting is accompanied by a low groan. He does not stand up, cannot stand up, and rolls onto his stomach, searching for his cane in the leaves. He does not find it. It flew quite far when he fell. A crow caws overhead, and he curses while struggling to push himself up onto his knees. One hand sinks into the frosty leaves and closes around something smooth and roughly the same diameter as his cane. He pulls on it, yanking it from the ground after a couple of firm tugs. He's not as strong as he once was. A brown stained bone comes up, and he stares at it before flinging it away from himself with a startled cry. He finally calls for help, having accepted that he's too injured to escape the forest of Quaking Aspen on his own. "Help," he screams. "Please, someone." But no one hears him, and each shout is more desperate than the last, until he's screaming himself hoarse, sobbing between breaths. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? The answer has never been more obvious to them than it is now. No one noticed him, fallen in the forest beneath the quaking aspen.